Richard Whitmore laughed out loud the moment his wife stood up in that courtroom and said she would represent herself. Not a quiet chuckle, not a polite smile, a real open laugh, the kind that says, "I've already won." He leaned over to his attorney and whispered something, and the two of them grinned like men watching a child challenge a chess grandmaster. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. The judge looked up, and Claire Whitmore, standing completely alone at her table, heard every word. Before we go any further, if you believe that a quiet woman can shake an entire courtroom, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning, moments that don't announce themselves with trumpets or dramatic music, but simply appear in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening, quiet and devastating like a crack spreading across the floor of a house you thought was built to last forever. For Claire Whitmore, that moment came on a rainy Tuesday night in October. She wasn't looking for it. She wasn't prepared for it. She had simply come downstairs in her bare feet, wearing the old gray sweater she kept, because Richard had never liked it, and the fact that he didn't like it was somehow the exact reason she kept putting it on. She was going to get a glass of water, that was all. But the door to Richard's home office was open just enough, just a few inches, and the voices inside were clear and certain, and completely unguarded the way people speak when they believe no one is listening. Richard's voice first, then the voice of Preston Hale, his attorney. Claire stopped in the hallway. She told herself later that she should have walked away, that listening to a private conversation was wrong, that she should have gone back upstairs and pretended she hadn't heard anything. But the first sentence she caught froze her feet to the floor. "She thinks we're at 6 million, Richard said. "Let her think that." Preston's voice smooth and practiced. "And the real number," Richard laughed softly, "3 times that, maybe more depending on how Harbor Point closes." Claire didn't move. The word we sat in her chest like a stone. She thinks we are at 6 million. Not the business, not the portfolio, the marriage, the 18 years, the life she had built alongside this man, dinner by dinner and decision by decision, every sacrifice quietly folded into the fabric of a shared existence she had assumed was honest. She pressed her back against the hallway wall. "And the Meridian documents?" Preston asked. "Already prepared," Richard said. "If anyone ever starts digging into the Harbor Point permits, the irregularities, the inspection reports, there are signatures on file that redirect the conversation very conveniently." "Whose signatures?" A pause. Then Richard casually, the way a man might mention what he'd ordered for lunch. "Claire's." The air left the hallway. "She signed those documents." Preston sounded mildly impressed. "She signed something," Richard said. "She never reads what she's signing. I stopped explaining the details years ago. Much easier for everyone." Preston said something Claire couldn't fully hear, and Richard laughed again, that same relaxed, confident laugh of a man who has already counted his winnings before the other player has even picked up their cards. "She won't fight," Richard said. "You know that. She hasn't held a real job in 18 years. She barely knows what's in her own checking account. If this goes to court, she'll take whatever we offer just to make it stop. And if she doesn't, then it gets uncomfortable for her," Richard said quietly. "Very uncomfortable." Claire stood in the hallway for what felt like a very long time. Her hands were cold, her face was completely still. And something inside her, something she hadn't heard from in a very long time, went entirely, absolutely silent. Not the silence of fear, the silence of a decision being made. She walked back upstairs without taking her glass of water. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, not crying, not thinking in words exactly, just sitting with the weight of what she had just heard pressing down on her shoulders like something physical and enormous. Then she got up. She went to the closet, not the main closet, not the one with Richard's suits lined up in precise, expensive order, but the storage closet at the end of the hallway, the one filled with boxes that hadn't been opened in years. She pulled the chain for the overhead light. She moved aside a box of old Christmas decorations. She moved aside a broken lamp Richard had always meant to have repaired and never did. And there at the very back was the box she was looking for. It wasn't a special box. It was plain brown cardboard, slightly dented at one corner with Claire Law written on the side in her own handwriting from what felt like another lifetime. She carried it to the bedroom. She sat cross-legged on the floor. She opened it. Her full name before Richard Whitmore was Claire Elizabeth Bennett. She had grown up in a small house in Greensboro, North Carolina, the only child of Harold Bennett, a CPA who wore the same 3 ties to work on rotation and kept every receipt he had ever generated stored in color-coded folders that filled 2 full filing cabinets in the spare bedroom. Harold Bennett believed with the quiet fervor of a man who had seen what happened when people didn't believe it, that the truth was always somewhere in the numbers. That money, where it came from, where it went, what name it traveled under, told a story that human beings were usually trying to disguise. Numbers can be manipulated, he told Claire regularly, usually over the dinner table with a yellow notepad nearby. But patterns are much harder to hide. You follow the pattern long enough and eventually the truth sits right there in front of you. Claire had been a good student. Not the most flamboyant, not the most immediately impressive, but careful and precise and relentlessly thorough in the way that tends to be invisible until it suddenly matters enormously. She had gone to law school, not because anyone had pushed her toward it, but because the law at its core was exactly what her father had spent his whole life doing at a kitchen table with a yellow notepad, finding the story underneath the story. She passed the North Carolina bar on her first attempt. She took a position at a small legal aid office in Charlotte, helping people who couldn't afford to pay someone to help them navigate a system that had never been designed with them in mind. She was good at it, not flashy, not dramatic, but the kind of good that made other people in the office bring her their complicated cases, the ones with too many documents and too many moving parts, because Claire would sit down and read every single page until she understood exactly what was happening and why. That was when she met Richard Whitmore. I was 31. He was starting his development company. He was charismatic and confident and funny in that particular way that certain men are funny, where everything he says sounds like something worth remembering. He told her she was the most interesting woman he had ever met. He told her she was extraordinary. He made her feel for the first time in her adult life like her precision and her thoroughness were not just professional virtues, but genuinely attractive qualities in a human being. They got married in the spring. It was a beautiful wedding. And then slowly, so slowly that Claire couldn't identify the exact moment it started, things began to change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. That's what made it so difficult to see clearly until it was already everywhere. Richard would suggest gently that he could handle the finances, that it was simpler that way since he was already managing the business accounts, that she shouldn't have to worry about the details. Claire had let him. Richard would mention casually that perhaps it wasn't necessary for her to keep working at the legal aid office, that the hours were long, that she seemed tired, that he made more than enough for both of them, and then some. Claire had let that go too. He would make small jokes, almost playful at first, at dinners with friends. "Claire barely opens a bill anymore," he'd say, laughing, and everyone else would laugh too, and Claire would smile because it felt easier to smile than to explain that the joke wasn't quite as funny as it sounded, that it had a sharper edge than the laughter suggested. Year by year, the jokes got a little more pointed. The decisions he made without consulting her became slightly larger. The times he corrected her in front of other people became slightly more frequent. And Claire, who had once sat in a small office reading every page of every complicated document until she understood it completely, began to believe not all at once, not through any single argument or incident, but through 18 years of small erosions that maybe Richard was right. Maybe she wasn't equipped for this world. Maybe she wasn't as sharp as she used to be. Maybe she had been away from professional life so long that she had lost whatever she'd had. She told herself these things in the privacy of her own thoughts, while outwardly maintaining the polished composure of a successful man's successful wife. She smiled at the charity galas. She thanked the appropriate people at the university events. She attended the fundraisers. And she signed the documents Richard placed in front of her without always reading them carefully, because he had spent years suggesting there was no point, that she wouldn't understand, that it was simpler to just trust him. She had trusted him. That was the thing she sat with on the floor of their bedroom, surrounded by the contents of a box from another lifetime. She had trusted him completely. The box held, among other things, her law school notebooks, their pages filled with her own careful handwriting, the margins dense with questions she had written to herself while she was learning. She flipped through one slowly, not rereading exactly, just feeling the weight of it, feeling the evidence of the person she had been before she had stopped believing she was that person. Underneath the notebooks, wrapped in a piece of old cloth, was her bar certificate. Claire held it. She read her own name. She read the date. She thought about her father, Harold Bennett, who had died 4 years ago, and who had even in his final year called her every Sunday evening and asked about her week with the kind of attention that made even ordinary things feel like they mattered. She thought about one particular Sunday, not long before he died, when he had said something she hadn't fully understood at the time. "There will come a point," he told her quietly, "when someone tries to convince you that you've forgotten everything you know. Don't let them, Claire. Don't let anyone take that from you." She had told him not to worry. She had believed then that it was a general observation, the kind of thing fathers say to daughters when they're worried and don't know exactly how to say it. Now, sitting on the floor in the dark, with her old bar certificate in her hands, she understood what he had been trying to tell her. He had seen it coming, and he had been trying to give her something to hold on to when it arrived. She set the certificate aside. She picked up the yellow notepad from the bottom of the box, the same kind her father had always kept at the dinner table. She found a pen on the nightstand, and she began to write. For the next 4 months, Claire said almost nothing. She attended dinners. She smiled at galas. She answered questions in the careful, neutral tones of a woman who had mastered the art of not quite revealing anything. Richard interpreted her silence as acceptance. He had filed for divorce in early November, served the papers through his attorney, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had already decided how the story ended and was simply moving through the procedural steps required to close it. "We're going to keep this civil," he told her in the kitchen the morning after she was served. "I've asked Preston to prepare something fair. You'll have everything you need." Claire looked at him over her coffee. "Thank you," she said. That was all. Richard nodded with the satisfied expression of a man who had just handled something smoothly. He did not know that the evening before, after the papers arrived, Claire had pulled out her old bar credentials and spent 3 hours on the phone with the North Carolina State Bar, confirming that her license, though lapsed from non-use, could be reinstated with the proper application. She submitted the application the next morning. She did not tell Richard. In the weeks that followed, while Richard and Preston Hale prepared what they fully expected to be an uncontested divorce proceeding, Claire worked in silence. She requested discovery. Richard's attorneys were momentarily surprised pro se litigants, occasionally made discovery requests, though rarely with precision, and then quickly moved to comply with a minimum of what was strictly required, assuming that Claire would not know what to do with what she received or what to ask for next. They were wrong. She asked for everything. She asked for Richard's complete financial disclosure. She asked for corporate records from Whitmore Urban Development. She asked for bank statements. She asked for the records of every company Richard had listed as a business partner or vendor in the previous 7 years. She stayed up until 2 and 3 in the morning at the kitchen table, with her father's yellow notepad going through every page. Her father's voice was with her the whole time. "You follow the pattern long enough, and eventually the truth sits right there in front of you." She followed the pattern, and gradually through the bank statements and the corporate filings and the vendor records and the transfer histories, the truth began to surface. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, detail emerging from detail until the full image becomes undeniable. There was a holding company called Redwood Capital Partners that appeared in none of Richard's financial disclosures, but received significant and regular transfers from Whitmore Urban Development accounts. There were consulting companies with large invoices and no obvious corresponding work, several of them registered at addresses that corresponded to offices connected to Richard's known business associates. One consulting company was linked to Grant Mercer, Richard's longtime business partner. Another was controlled by Natalie Cross, the 29-year-old director of communications at Whitmore Urban Development, a woman whose name appeared in Richard's calendar with a frequency that told its own story before Claire had confirmed anything. And there were the Harbor Point documents. Claire found references to them buried in a string of emails. Discovery had produced them technically, though they had been produced in a format clearly designed to be difficult to read in sequence. Claire read them in sequence anyway, printing each one and arranging them by date on the dining room table over the course of a long Sunday. What emerged was a pattern of altered inspection reports, adjusted cost estimates, invoices for structural work that may or may not have been performed, and on one document, one particular authorization form a signature, her signature, or something that looked very much like it. Claire stared at that document for a long time. Then she looked at the date on it. She pulled out her phone and scrolled backward through her calendar until she found that week. She stopped. She looked at the date on the document again. Then she picked up her yellow notepad and wrote one line, "I was in Savannah." On the morning of this hearing, Richard arrived with Preston Hale and 2 additional attorneys. They carried organized binders and moved with the coordinated confidence of people who have done this many times in service of people with resources who expected to win. Claire arrived alone. She carried a folder of documents and her yellow notepad. She wore a navy blazer and simple dark trousers, the kind of clothes that say nothing except, "I am here and I am serious." The gallery was already full. Word had gotten around the way it does in a city like Charlotte when a divorce touches a prominent name and involves enough money to make the outcome professionally interesting to reporters, competitors, and people who simply liked a story. Richard saw her when she walked in. He watched her take her seat at her table. He leaned toward Preston and said something, and Preston glanced in her direction and smiled. Richard's smile was wider. Claire set her folder on the table. She did not look at Richard. She straightened the pages in front of her with both hands. She breathed. Judge Eleanor Maddox entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. Judge Maddox was 62 years old and had been on the bench for 14 years. She was known in the way that judges become known among the lawyers who appear before them regularly for her patience, her thoroughness, and her complete intolerance for anyone who attempted to waste her time or manipulate her courtroom. She looked at both tables. She looked at the empty chairs beside Claire. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said with the mild concern of someone asking a reasonable question, "where is your attorney?" Claire rose. She was aware of every pair of eyes in the room. She was aware of Richard relaxed in his chair, watching her the way a man watches something he finds mildly entertaining. She took one breath. "I am representing myself, Your Honor." The courtroom shifted. It was a small sound chair's papers, the rustle of people adjusting their positions, but it was unmistakable. The collective recalibration of a room full of people who had expected something different. And Richard laughed. Not quietly, not under his breath. An actual laugh, brief and unchecked, the sound of a man who has just heard something genuinely funny and cannot be bothered to disguise his amusement. Several people in the gallery turned toward him. His attorney put a hand on his arm, the practiced gesture of a professional managing a client, and leaned close with a whispered remark that made Richard's grin widen rather than disappear. Claire heard the laugh. She was meant to hear it. She felt it land in her chest, the way those small things always land: the laugh, the dismissal, the casual certainty that you are not worth taking seriously. She had been feeling that landing for 18 years. She had learned to absorb it, to let it pass through her without visible effect, to keep her expression neutral and her voice steady, even while something inside her quietly recorded every single instance. She absorbed this one too, but something was different now. She looked down at her yellow notepad. She thought about her father. She thought about the kitchen table where he had taught her that the truth was always somewhere in the numbers, and that patterns were very hard to hide. And she thought about 4 months of late nights and printed documents and discovery responses, and the single line she had written in her own handwriting when she looked at the date on that forged document, "I was in Savannah." Her hands were on the table in front of her. She noticed with a kind of detached clarity that they were not trembling. Judge Maddox looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you certain you wish to proceed without counsel?" "I am, Your Honor," Claire said. "I passed the North Carolina bar examination. My license has been reinstated. I am qualified to represent myself." A longer pause in the room this time. Richard's smile did not disappear, but something at the edges of it became slightly less certain. Preston Hale was no longer grinning. He was looking at Claire with an expression that had shifted fractionally from amusement to attention. Judge Maddox made a note. "Very well," she said. "We will proceed." She looked at Preston Hale's table. "Mr. Hale, opening statement for the petitioner." Preston rose and began. Hal was good at this part. He had a barrister's gift for narrative, the ability to take a collection of facts and arrange them into a story so logical and so sympathetic that the alternative version of events becomes difficult to even hold in your mind. He described Richard Whitmore with warmth, the self-made man, the entrepreneur, the charitable contributor to his community, the husband who had supported his wife completely for 18 years and asked only now with great reluctance and sadness for the court to recognize that the marriage had ended and the assets should be divided fairly. He described Claire without cruelty. He didn't need cruelty. He simply said repeatedly, and in various careful formulations, that Claire had not worked professionally in nearly 2 decades, had not contributed financially to the marital estate, had not participated in business decisions, and had, in the years since leaving her brief legal career, lived entirely on Richard's income and Richard's success. He paused. He let that sit. Then he said gently, "Mrs. Whitmore deserves to be treated with dignity. She deserves financial security. My client wishes to provide that. But the court should not mistake generosity for concession. The wealth in this estate was created by Richard Whitmore, through vision, through hard work, through risk that Mrs. Whitmore never shared." He sat down. The room was quiet. Richard looked at Claire with the settled expression of a man who has just watched someone else make an excellent point he was planning to make himself. Claire looked at her notepad. Then she stood. She was aware of how still the room was. She was aware of the reporters at the back. She was aware of Richard watching. She started softly, almost conversationally, the way her father used to start at the dinner table before he got to the number that mattered. "Your Honor," she said, "opposing counsel is correct that I have not held a formal position in Richard Whitmore's company. I have not attended his board meetings. I have not signed his executive contracts." She paused. "But I would like to invite this court to ask a slightly different question." She looked up. "Not what I contributed to Richard Whitmore's business, but what happened to what we built together." She turned toward this gallery, not theatrically, just enough to establish that she was addressing everyone in the room, not just the bench. Because the marital estate that Richard disclosed to this court represents approximately $6 million in assets. She picked up a document from her folder. "And the marital estate I have documented through discovery and public corporate filings is substantially larger." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Richard's smile was still present, but he had uncrossed his legs. "Your Honor," Claire said, "I'd like to introduce the court to an entity called Redwood Capital Partners." And the hearing truly began. She walked the court through it methodically, not rushing, not performing, just presenting. The transfers, the dates, the amounts, the corporate filings showing Redwood Capital Partners' existence, its registration, its ownership structure. Preston objected. Claire addressed the objection. Judge Maddox heard both arguments, asked 2 precise questions, and allowed the evidence. Preston objected again. Claire addressed the objection again. Richard wrote something on a notepad and slid it to Preston. Preston read it. His expression did not change, but he wrote something back and slid it toward Richard, and Richard read it, and his jaw tightened very slightly. Claire kept going. The consulting companies, the payments, the addresses, the names attached to those companies' names that connected one by one to people Richard knew and worked with and had made arrangements with. Grant Mercer, Natalie Cross. She did not say Natalie Cross's name with heat. She said it factually, the way she said every other name, without editorial comment, letting the documents carry the weight. And then she said, "The question this court needs to consider is not whether these arrangements were business decisions Richard Whitmore was entitled to make. The question is whether they were disclosed, and whether the assets associated with them are properly included in this court's assessment of the marital estate." She set down the documents. She looked at Judge Maddox. "I believe the evidence will show that they were not disclosed, and that the marital estate before this court has been substantially and deliberately understated." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Richard leaned toward Preston and spoke quietly, urgently. Preston listened and nodded slowly with the careful nod of a man who is adjusting his plans in real time. From across the room, without looking up from her notepad, Claire heard Richard's voice drop lower. She recognized the tone. It was the tone he used when something wasn't going the way he had expected. She had heard that tone many times over 18 years. She had spent most of those years trying to smooth things over when she heard it, apologizing, accommodating, making herself smaller so that his reaction had less to collide with. She didn't do any of that now. She wrote a note on her yellow notepad, she underlined it, and she waited for what was coming next. Because Richard Whitmore, for the first time in 18 years, did not know what she had in that folder, and Claire Bennett, who had spent 4 months following the pattern until the truth sat right there in front of her, knew exactly what she had. She was ready. She had been ready for a long time. Preston Hale was already on his feet before Claire had fully settled into her chair. He moved toward the center of the room with the practiced ease of a man who had stood in courtrooms for 30 years and learned exactly how much space to occupy, exactly how long to pause before speaking, exactly which words carried weight and which ones carried the illusion of weight. He was very good at both. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying that particular blend of gravity and warmth that expensive attorneys develop over decades of being paid to sound reasonable. "What my client is asking for today is very simple. Fairness, nothing more." He let the words sit there. Fairness. As though it were a gift Richard Whitmore was offering rather than a calculation he had already made. Preston walked the court through Richard's biography with the confidence of a man narrating a legend. The early years, the risk, the vision, the long nights building Whitmore Urban Development from a single commercial contract into one of North Carolina's most prominent development companies. He described Richard's work ethic with reverence. He described his charitable contributions with humility. He described the marriage with a kind of careful, practiced sadness. Two people who had grown in different directions, no one truly at fault, a partnership that had simply run its course. And then he described Claire. Not cruelly. He was far too skilled for cruelty. He simply described her absence. 18 years away from professional life. No financial contribution to the marital estate. No participation in business decisions. No risk shared. No capital invested. A life, he implied without quite saying, that had been entirely provided for, generously, completely, by the man sitting at the other table. Richard sat with his hands folded, wearing the expression of a man who is trying very hard to appear humble about something he privately considers obvious. Claire wrote one word on her yellow notepad. She underlined it twice. Then she set down her pen and waited. When Preston sat down, Judge Maddox looked at Claire's table. "Mrs. Whitmore, your opening statement." Claire stood. She took a breath, not a theatrical breath, not the kind meant to signal drama, but the quiet breath of someone organizing their thoughts before beginning something important. "Your Honor," she said, "I want to start by agreeing with something Mr. Hale just said." That surprised the room. She could feel it, the slight shift, the recalibration. "He's correct that I did not run Whitmore Urban Development. I didn't negotiate the contracts. I didn't attend the board meetings. I didn't generate the revenue figures he described." She paused. "But this case isn't about what Richard Whitmore built. This case is about what happened to what we built, together, and about what this court has not yet been shown." She picked up her first document. "Your Honor, opposing counsel presented a marital estate valued at approximately $6 million. I'd like to introduce this court to a company called Redwood Capital Partners, an entity that appears nowhere in my husband's sworn financial disclosure, but has received over the past 6 years transfers totaling in excess of $11 million from Whitmore Urban Development operating accounts." The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. This was the quiet of attention fully engaged, the quiet of people leaning slightly forward without realizing they were doing it. Richard's smile did not disappear, but it tightened. Preston was already on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Foundation. The source of these documents has not been established." Claire turned toward the bench without missing a beat. "Your Honor, these documents were produced in response to discovery requests served on Petitioner's Counsel on November 14th. They are authenticated by the corporate registration records of the state of North Carolina, cross-referenced with bank statements that Petitioner himself submitted as part of his initial disclosure. I can walk the court through the authentication chain document by document if that would be helpful." Judge Maddox looked at Preston. "Mr. Hale." Preston hesitated for exactly 1 second too long. "We would ask for additional time to review the foundation before these documents are admitted." "You've had the same discovery timeline as Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Maddox said. "Objection overruled. Continue, Mrs. Whitmore." That was the first crack. Claire continued. She laid out Redwood Capital Partners with the patience of someone who had spent months arranging this information in exactly the right order so that each piece made the next piece impossible to dismiss. The transfers, the dates, the amounts, the timing payments that consistently preceded major Whitmore Urban Development contract awards by a period of weeks, the kind of pattern that doesn't explain itself. Richard wrote something and slid it to Preston. Preston read it, wrote something back. Richard read Preston's response, and his jaw moved slightly, the way it moved when he was keeping himself from saying something he wanted to say. Claire didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the bench and on her documents and on the careful sequential logic of what she was building. Then she introduced the consulting companies. There were 6 of them, each with names that sounded professional and purposeful: Meridian Strategic Group, North Point Consulting Associates, Coastal Development Advisory Services, each with invoices, each with payments, each when examined carefully sharing something slightly off addresses that corresponded to commercial mail forwarding services, rather than actual offices, registered agents, who appeared on the filings of multiple companies, with no obvious connection, executives, whose names, when run through publicly available corporate records, traced back to people Richard Whitmore knew personally and professionally. "Your Honor," Claire said, setting down one stack of documents and picking up another, Meridian Strategic Group received $430,000 in consulting fees from Whitmore Urban Development over a period of 3 years. The registered address for Meridian Strategic Group is a UPS store location in South Charlotte. The registered agent for Meridian Strategic Group is the same individual who serves as registered agent for 7 other entities, 4 of which share financial relationships with Whitmore Urban Development. She let that sit. The managing member of Meridian Strategic Group, she continued, is a woman named Natalie Cross. The room shifted. Richard's posture changed. It was subtle, the kind of change a person makes when they are very carefully not reacting, but it was there, and several people in the gallery noticed it because they had been watching him. Preston rose. "Your Honor, I must object to what appears to be a personal attack on individuals who are not parties to this proceeding." "I'm not attacking anyone," Claire said calmly before Judge Maddox could respond. "I'm tracing money. The money leads where it leads. The individuals associated with these entities are relevant to the financial picture of the marital estate, nothing more." Judge Maddox looked at Preston. "She's right, Mr. Hale. Sit down." Preston sat down. Richard looked at the table in front of him. For the first time that morning, he did not look like a man watching an entertainment. Claire moved on to North Point Consulting Associates, payments totaling $680,000. Managing member Grant Mercer, Richard's business partner of 11 years, his closest professional associate, the man who had stood as his best man at their wedding. She documented the payments without drama. Dates, amounts, source accounts. She connected each transfer to specific quarters in Whitmore Urban Development's operating history, showing that the payments clustered around periods when the company's reported profits were lower than its revenue growth would have predicted. She was building a picture, not of an affair, not of personal betrayal, of money, of where it had gone and whose names were attached to where it had gone, and what that pattern meant for the true value of the marital estate. And then Richard's team counterattacked. Preston called his first witness, a therapist who had seen Claire twice briefly during a difficult period 3 years ago, and who had documented sessions that Richard's attorneys had, through a legal process, Claire hadn't anticipated obtained access to. The therapist spoke carefully professionally about anxiety, about episodes of what she called disproportionate emotional response, about Claire's expressed difficulty during that period, distinguishing her own perceptions from external reality. The implication was clear without being stated. Claire watched the jury. There was no jury. This was a bench trial, but old habits made her scan the faces in the gallery and saw the moment the implication landed. The slight doubt appearing on several faces. The reconsideration. Richard's attorney followed the therapist with a former household employee, a woman who had worked for them briefly, and who described with careful vagueness instances of Claire becoming upset, becoming fixated on things going through Richard's papers. "She was always going through things," the woman said, "looking for something. I never knew what. It made me uncomfortable." Preston let that hang in the air. Then he said gently, "Would you describe Mrs. Whitmore's behavior during that period as stable?" The woman paused. "I wouldn't know." Claire wrote something on her notepad. She did not look up. But inside something that had been calm and controlled for weeks felt the first genuine pull of fear. This was what Richard had always done. When facts became inconvenient, he shifted the conversation to character, to perception, to the idea that the person seeing clearly was actually the person who couldn't be trusted to see. He had done it to her for 18 years in private. Now he was doing it in front of a judge. She picked up her pen. She wrote 2 words on her notepad, his emails. Then she crossed out his emails and wrote his own words. When Preston finished and Judge Maddox indicated that Claire could respond, Claire stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 37. She walked to the bench and handed the document to the clerk. This is an email from Richard Whitmore to his Director of Operations, dated March of last year, during the same period described by the previous witnesses as a time when I was, quote, unstable and going through papers. She paused. In this email, Richard writes, and I'm reading directly from the document, run the Hargrove contract terms past Claire before we sign. She catches details everyone else misses. The courtroom absorbed that. Claire looked at Richard for the first time since she had started speaking. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to also introduce Exhibit 38, an email from the same period in which Richard writes to Grant Mercer. Claire reviewed the Henderson documents. She flagged 3 clauses we would have missed. I keep telling you she's sharper than she looks. She set the exhibit down. And Exhibit 39, Richard writing to his attorney, the same attorney sitting at that table, quote, don't underestimate Claire. She understands more than she lets on. The silence was extraordinary. Preston Hale had written something on his legal pad and stopped writing halfway through it. Richard was looking at the table with an expression that had moved beyond careful control into something rawer and less managed. Claire looked at him directly. Her voice was steady. So I want to ask this court to consider a question. She looked at Judge Maddox. Which version of Claire Whitmore is Richard presenting as true? The unstable woman who couldn't be trusted with her own perceptions, or the meticulous woman he trusted to review contracts when her attention was financially valuable to him? She let the question breathe, because both cannot be true, and his own emails tell us which one he believed when he thought no one outside his circle was listening. Richard looked up. For just a moment, one unguarded, unscripted moment, his expression was not anger or contempt or amusement. It was something closer to recognition, the recognition of a man who has just realized that the person across from him was never who he thought she was. Then the mask came back. But Claire had seen it, and she was fairly certain Judge Maddox had seen it too. Preston rose and began a redirect that was technically competent, but lacked the momentum he'd had before. He challenged the context of the emails. He argued that complimenting a spouse in private correspondence was not equivalent to endorsing her professional judgment in a legal proceeding. He was professional and thorough, and everyone in the room could feel that he was working harder than he'd expected to work today. Richard passed him another note. Preston read it. His expression shifted slightly. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and Claire understood from watching that exchange that they were changing strategy. What came next was designed to destabilize her completely. Preston's next line of argument concerned the assets that Claire had identified as hidden or improperly excluded from disclosure. His position was that Redwood Capital Partners was a legitimate business vehicle, a holding structure that Richard had established for valid tax and estate planning purposes, and that its assets were in fact separate property rather than marital property. He produced documents, articles of organization, tax filings, an opinion from a CPA that had been prepared, Claire noted, in the past 3 weeks. He argued with confidence and detail, and then he said something that Claire had not anticipated. He said, furthermore, Your Honor, petitioner would like to address the question of liability regarding certain Harbor Point development documents, specifically authorization forms, bearing Mrs. Whitmore's signature, which may expose her to regulatory scrutiny, regardless of the outcome of these proceedings. The room changed temperature. Claire felt it, the deliberate chill of the implication. He wasn't just defending Richard. He was threatening her. He was putting the Harbor Point documents on the table with her name on them as a warning: settle or face something worse than this divorce. Judge Maddox's eyes moved to Claire, not unkindly, but with the focused attention of someone watching to see how a person handles a particular kind of pressure. Claire looked down at her notepad. Her hands were on the table. She noticed they were not shaking. She thought about the night in October, the hallway, the cold floor under her bare feet, Richard's voice through the gap in the door. She won't fight. She doesn't even know what she's looking at. She thought about what she had found on a Sunday afternoon when she printed every email in sequence and arranged them on the dining room table. She looked up. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to address the Harbor Point documents directly, and I'd like to begin with the one bearing my signature. She walked to the bench with the document. This authorization form, which Petitioner's Counsel has just referenced, bears a date of February 19th. It purports to show my authorization of a financial amendment related to the Harbor Point project. She turned to face the room. On February 19th, I was not in Charlotte. She reached for her next exhibit, I was in Savannah, Georgia, attending my mother's funeral. She laid the documents on the clerk's desk one by one, with the unhurried precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment, not because it was a performance, but because she wanted to be absolutely certain she didn't miss anything. Hotel records from the Savannah Marriott. Checked in February 18th. Checked out February 21st. Toll records from Interstate 95 showing her vehicle passing through at 7:43 in the morning on the 18th. A program from her mother's memorial service dated February 19th, with Claire listed as a speaker. Photographs time-stamped geolocated taken at the cemetery. And a sworn statement from Reverend Marcus Webb of First Baptist Church of Savannah, who had presided over the service and who confirmed that Claire Whitmore had delivered a eulogy at 2:15 in the afternoon on February 19th. Preston Hale had gone very still. Richard was looking at his attorney with an expression that contained a question. Preston was not looking back at him. "Your Honor," Claire said, "I was 400 miles away on the date of that document's supposed signing, but there is something else." She introduced Exhibit 44. "During the discovery process, I requested the original electronic file associated with this document. The metadata embedded in that file, which is visible to any standard document examination tool, and which I have had independently verified by a forensic document analyst whose report is Exhibit 45, shows that this document was created on Richard Whitmore's office computer." She paused. "On February 21st. She let that land. 2 days after the date printed on the document itself. The courtroom was absolutely still. "The document is backdated," Claire said quietly. "The signature is not mine, and the metadata proves both." Richard pushed his chair back from the table. It made a scraping sound that everyone heard. Preston reached out and put a firm hand on Richard's arm. Richard leaned toward him and said something in a low, urgent voice. Preston responded in an equally low voice, but his body language had changed completely. He was no longer managing a confident client. He was managing a man who was beginning to understand that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. Judge Maddox looked at the exhibits. She looked at Claire. She looked at Preston's table with an expression that was carefully neutral, but contained something that was not quite neutrality. "Mr. Hale," she said, "does petitioner wish to respond to this evidence?" Preston stood. He was composed. He was always composed. That was what 30 years in courtrooms produced, a kind of professional composure that held its shape even when everything behind it was shifting. "Your Honor, petitioner disputes the characterization of the metadata analysis and would request the opportunity to present a rebuttal expert." "That request is noted," Judge Maddox said. "We'll take a recess." She stood. Everyone stood. And in the moment before the room broke into movement and sound, Richard looked at Claire across the space between their tables. He looked at her the way he had looked at her 18 years ago, across a different room, before she had let him convince her that she was someone smaller and less capable than she actually was. He looked at her like he was trying to understand something. Claire looked back. She didn't smile. She didn't show him anything. She simply gathered her documents, aligned the edges carefully, and set them in her folder. Her father's voice was in her head, the way it always was when she was in the middle of something that mattered. "You follow the pattern long enough, and the truth sits right there in front of you." She had followed it, and it was sitting right there. She clicked her pen closed. She sat down. She waited, because she wasn't done, not even close. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Claire sat at her table. She did not check her phone. She did not speak to anyone. She reviewed her next set of exhibits with the concentrated focus of a person who knows that what happens in the next few hours matters more than almost anything else she has ever done. Across the room, Preston Hale was on his phone. Richard sat beside him, elbows on the table, speaking in a voice too low to carry across the room. At one point, he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Claire recognized immediately, because it was the gesture he made when he was genuinely worried, not performing worry, but actually feeling it. He had made that gesture the year his first major project had nearly fallen through. He had made it the night the bank called about the refinancing. How was making it now? Preston ended his phone call. He turned to Richard and said something. Richard shook his head. Preston said something else more firmly, and Richard looked at the table, and then looked at Claire, and then looked back at the table. Claire turned back to her documents. When Judge Maddox returned and the room settled, Preston stood and said in the careful tones of a man reordering a complex argument, "Your Honor, petitioner would like to address the timeline discrepancy raised by respondent's exhibit. We believe there is a technical explanation for the metadata anomaly that does not support the conclusion Mrs. Whitmore has drawn. Judge Maddox looked at him. Is petitioner prepared to present that explanation today? A brief pause. We would request 48 hours to consult with a technical expert. Request denied, Judge Maddox said. We continue. Richard's hand moved toward Preston's arm. Preston moved his arm away almost imperceptibly and stood straighter. Claire stood. Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness. She said the name quietly, but it landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Natalie Cross. Richard went completely still. The room buzzed. From the back, a woman stood early 30s, composed in the way people are composed when they have spent days preparing themselves for something they know is going to be difficult, but have decided to do anyway. She walked to the witness stand and sat down. She did not look at Richard. Richard did not look at her. Claire approached the stand. She looked at Natalie Cross for a moment, not with hostility, not with the performance of a wronged wife confronting the other woman, but with something more measured, more human. Ms. Cross, she said, you were employed at Whitmore Urban Development as Director of Communications. I was, Natalie said. Her voice was steady. And you have been in a personal relationship with Richard Whitmore. Yes. Did Richard Whitmore make representations to you about his plans following the conclusion of his marriage? Natalie looked at her hands briefly. Then she looked up. He told me he was going to establish a new company after the divorce. He said he wanted me to take a leadership role in it. And when did your understanding of those plans change? Natalie was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. When I found the emails. Can you describe what you found? I found correspondence between Richard and Grant Mercer, Natalie said, from about 6 weeks ago. They were discussing how to structure the Harbor Point liability documentation. Richard said, she paused, collected herself, continued. Richard said that the consulting arrangements needed to be structured so that the paper trail pointed to individuals who could not effectively defend themselves. He listed 3 names. Was your name on that list? Yes, Natalie said. Was it the only name? Natalie looked at Claire directly for the first time. No, yours was on it too. The courtroom erupted briefly, not loudly, but with the collective sharp intake and murmur of people who have just heard something they did not expect. Judge Maddox raised her hand, and the room quieted. Richard's composure had fractured. It wasn't dramatic, he didn't stand up or shout or make any sudden movement. But the careful architecture of his public face, the controlled expression he had maintained all morning, had developed visible cracks. His jaw was set too hard. His hands on the table were pressed too flat. Preston leaned toward him. Richard turned and said something short and sharp. Preston pulled back slightly. Claire looked at Natalie Cross. Ms. Cross, do you have copies of the correspondence you described? I do, Natalie said. Were those documents obtained legally and through your own access as an employee of Whitmore Urban Development? They were sent to my company email address, Natalie said. I was copied on several of them. Others I was forwarded. All of them came to me through legitimate channels during my employment. Claire turned towards the bench. Your Honor, I would like to introduce into evidence a packet of correspondence marked as Exhibits 46 through 53 provided by Ms. Cross. Preston objected on 4 separate grounds. Claire addressed each objection individually calmly, without raising her voice, with the steady rhythm of someone who had anticipated every objection before it was made, because she had spent months thinking through exactly this proceeding. Judge Maddox admitted the documents. Richard wrote something on his notepad, looked at it, crossed it out, and wrote something else. Claire presented the documents. They were worse than anything she had described in her opening statement. The correspondence between Richard and Grant Mercer was not the careful elliptical language of people being deliberately vague. It was direct. It named the Harbor Point inspection irregularities explicitly. It discussed the consulting invoice structure in terms that left very little room for innocent interpretation. And it named the people, including Natalie Cross and Claire Whitmore, who were intended to absorb liability if the structure was ever examined. There was one message in particular. Richard had written to Grant Mercer, "The Claire signature problem is handled." If anyone looks too closely at the February documents, the conversation becomes about her, not us. She's been out of the game too long to fight it effectively. The courtroom was completely silent when Claire read that sentence aloud. Then she set down the document, and she looked at Richard. He was looking at the table. "Your Honor," Claire said, I have one question I would like the record to reflect. She looked at the bench, then back at Richard. My husband spent 18 years telling me I wasn't capable enough to understand our finances, that I wasn't equipped to manage complexity, that I should simply trust him. She paused. And then he put my name on a forged document because he believed I wouldn't be capable of proving it was forged. Her voice was very quiet. I was betting everything on the idea that he had convinced me of something that was never true. She turned back to the bench. The evidence shows he was wrong. She walked back to her table and sat down. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Preston Hale rose and began what would turn out to be a significantly weakened cross-examination of Natalie Cross, questioning her motives, her reliability, her emotional state, following what he carefully described as a personal disappointment. Natalie answered every question with the controlled precision of someone who had already examined her own motivations very carefully and made peace with them before walking into the room. She did not waver. When Preston finished, Judge Maddox looked at the clock. She looked at both tables. We'll resume tomorrow morning at 9, she said. I'll expect petitioner's counsel to be prepared to address the document authentication questions in full. And Mr. Hale, she paused, and the pause itself carried a particular weight. I want complete financial disclosures properly prepared on my desk by 8 a.m. She looked at Richard for just a moment, then she looked away. The gavel came down. The room began to move. Claire stayed in her seat. She organized her exhibits slowly, methodically, the way her father had always organized his files by date, by category, by the internal logic of the story they were telling together. She could feel Richard's presence across the room, even without looking. She could feel the weight of what had just happened. Not triumph exactly, not satisfaction, but something steadier and more serious. The feeling of a thing being true and being seen as true, which is different from simply winning. She heard him speak, his voice low and urgent, talking to Preston. And then she heard something she had not expected. He said her name, not she, not my wife, not the casual third-person dismissal she had grown accustomed to over 18 years. Her name. Claire. She looked up. He was standing at his table. Preston was gathering documents beside him pointedly, not participating in whatever was about to happen. Richard looked at her across the room. His face, for the first time all day, was not performing anything. Was any of this worth it? He said, not loudly, not aggressively, with something that might, in another context and from another man, have resembled genuine bewilderment. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her folder. She stood. She straightened her jacket. And she said quietly enough that only he could hear it, "Ask me again when you understand what you actually did." Then she walked out. Her heels on the courtroom floor, one step at a time, not as Richard Whitmore's wife, not as the woman everyone had expected to fold, but as someone who had remembered in the middle of the night at a kitchen table with a yellow notepad exactly who she had always been. And tomorrow she would come back, and she would finish it. She didn't sleep, not really. Claire sat at the kitchen table until past midnight with her yellow notepad and a cup of tea that went cold without her noticing, going through her exhibits for the following morning, the way a surgeon reviews a procedure before walking into the operating room, not because she didn't know the material, but because knowing it completely was the only thing that kept the fear from having too much room. And there was fear. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, not even to herself. What had happened in that courtroom today had been significant. The metadata, the Savannah records, Natalie's testimony, each one had landed and she had watched them land, and she knew they had done real damage to Richard's position. But she also knew Richard. She had known him for 22 years. She knew that when he felt cornered, he didn't retreat. He escalated. He found another angle. He reached for something unexpected and used it before the other person had time to prepare. He would come back tomorrow with something. She just didn't know what yet. She wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What haven't I accounted for?" Then she sat with that question for a long time. She thought about Grant Mercer. She thought about what Mercer's cooperation, or lack of it, could mean for the Harbor Point investigation that had quietly begun to take shape around the edges of what was supposed to be a divorce proceeding. She thought about the forensic accountant she had retained, Dr. Pauline Ash, who was scheduled to testify in the morning. She thought about Samuel Reed, the former project manager, whose name had appeared in the Harbor Point construction records, who had called her 3 weeks ago out of nowhere, who had said in a voice tight with something between guilt and relief, "I need to tell someone what I saw. I've needed to tell someone for a long time." She wrote Samuel Reed's name on the notepad. She underlined it. Then she wrote one more line, the line that had been sitting at the back of her mind all evening. "Richard knows about the internal report." She stared at that line. She circled it. Then she turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while, not sleeping, but not quite thinking either, in that borderland state where the mind processes things it can't fully articulate yet. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he used to say goodnight when she was young. He'd stand in her doorway and say, "You know everything you need to know, Claire. Just don't forget it in the morning." She had thought it was just a thing he said. She understood now that it wasn't. She closed her eyes. At 6:15, she was back at the kitchen table with fresh coffee and her exhibits in order. At 8:30, she walked into the courthouse. At 8:59, she was at her table. At 9 o'clock exactly, Judge Eleanor Maddox walked in, and the second day of the hearing that would change everything began. Richard arrived looking like he had slept. He was in a different suit, charcoal again, but darker, more formal. His hair was perfectly arranged. He moved to his seat with the deliberate composure of a man who had spent the previous evening rebuilding his presentation from the inside out. Preston Hale set a stack of new documents on the table. Claire noticed the stack was thicker than anything Preston had brought the day before. She noted it without reacting. She turned to her own documents. Judge Maddox looked at both tables. "Mr. Hale, you indicated petitioner had additional financial disclosures to present this morning." Preston rose. "Yes, Your Honor. Petitioner has prepared a supplemental disclosure addressing a brief practiced pause, certain additional assets that were inadvertently omitted from the initial filing due to a clerical oversight in our accounting process." The word inadvertently floated in the air of the courtroom like something that smelled wrong. Judge Maddox looked at the document for a long moment. She did not say anything about the word inadvertently. She didn't need to. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you'll have the opportunity to review and respond to this supplemental disclosure." "Thank you, Your Honor," Claire said. The clerk brought her a copy. Claire opened it. She read the first page, then the second. Then she turned to the third and stopped. The supplemental disclosure acknowledged 2 investment accounts and a mountain property that had not appeared in Richard's original filing. Their combined value was listed at $1.4 million. The disclosure described them as assets that had been under review for classification purposes. The language of a man being forced to show his hand while still trying to control the narrative around what he was showing. Claire turned to the 4th page. Harbor Point was listed, its estimated current value, its projected value upon completion. She read the number twice. Then she set the document down and looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds, not because she was surprised, but because the number was higher than even she had estimated, and she needed one moment to absorb what that meant for everything that followed. She picked up her pen. She wrote a number on her yellow notepad. She circled it. Then she looked at Preston Hale across the room and understood from the careful neutrality of his expression that he knew she had found it. Preston began his morning presentation by calling an expert witness, a forensic accountant named Gerald Moss, who had been retained. Claire noted within the past 72 hours, which meant Richard had made that call immediately after leaving the courthouse the previous afternoon. Gerald Moss was polished, credentialed, and prepared to testify that the Redwood Capital Partners transfers were consistent with legitimate tax planning strategies and that the consulting payments to entities connected to Richard's associates fell within normal industry parameters for development projects of comparable scale. He testified for 40 minutes. He was good. Claire listened to every word and took 4 pages of notes and let him finish completely before she stood. When she stood, she said, "Mr. Moss, in your professional experience, is it standard practice for consulting invoices to be dated before the consulting agreements that authorized them were signed?" Gerald Moss paused. "That would be a regular yes. I have here Exhibits 61 through 64, which are invoices from Meridian Strategic Group and North Point Consulting Associates, cross-referenced with the corresponding consulting agreements. The invoices predate the agreements by an average of 19 days. She handed copies to the clerk. "Does that change your characterization of these payments as consistent with normal industry practice?" A longer pause. "I would need to review those documents." "Of course," Claire said pleasantly. "Take your time." He reviewed them. The courtroom waited. Gerald Moss looked up. His expression had the particular quality of a man recalculating something he had been paid to not need to recalculate. "This is irregular," he said. "Thank you," Claire said. "Nothing further." Preston did not look at Richard. Richard did not look at Preston. That was the first mini-climax of the morning, and it was 9:47. Dr. Pauline Ash took the stand at 10:15. She was 61 years old, small, precise, with the kind of quiet authority that comes not from performance, but from knowing things with complete certainty for a very long time. She had been a forensic accountant for 33 years. She had testified in over 200 cases. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and referred to her notes with a deliberate, unhurried manner that made everything she said feel like established fact rather than opinion. Preston objected to her qualifications. Judge Maddox overruled the objection in 30 seconds. Dr. Ash began. She walked the court through the financial structure of Whitmore Urban Development over a 7-year period with the clarity of someone explaining something simple to people who were perfectly capable of understanding it. She connected the Redwood Capital Partners transfers to specific project cycles. She showed how consulting payments clustered around permit application periods for Harbor Point and 2 earlier projects. She demonstrated with spreadsheets she had prepared and that were now entered into evidence that the pattern of outflows from Whitmore Urban Development's operating accounts was inconsistent with a legitimate consulting relationship and consistent with, she chose her words with professional care, a deliberate strategy to reduce the apparent value of the marital estate during the period leading up to the divorce filing. Richard wrote something furiously on his notepad. Preston read it without visibly reacting. Dr. Ash concluded, "In my professional opinion, the legitimate marital estate in this matter is substantially larger than the figure presented in petitioner's original disclosure, and I would note larger than the supplemental disclosure provided this morning as well. My estimate based on available documentation places the total marital estate at a figure closer to $22 million. The room reacted. Not loudly, this was still a courtroom, and Judge Maddox's presence prevented anything truly disruptive. But the collective intake of breath, the shift of bodies, the quiet but unmistakable sound of the gallery, processing a number that was more than 3 times what Richard had originally disclosed. Richard stood up. Preston grabbed his arm. Richard sat back down. But the movement had happened, and everyone had seen it, and Judge Maddox had seen it, and she looked at Richard with an expression that did not require any words. Preston cross-examined Dr. Ash for 40 minutes. He challenged her methodology. He challenged her data sources. He challenged her assumptions about which assets qualified as marital property versus separate property. He was thorough and professional and almost entirely ineffective, because Dr. Ash answered every challenge with the steady, detailed confidence of someone who had already considered every objection he was raising and had incorporated the answers into her analysis before he thought to ask. When Preston sat down, he leaned close to Richard and spoke quietly. Richard shook his head. Preston spoke again. Richard looked at the table. He made the gesture Claire had seen the previous afternoon, the hand through the hair, the tell she knew better than almost anyone in the room. The sign that he was genuinely not performatively worried. She looked away from him and checked her notes. Samuel Reed was next. She called his name. He walked in from the hallway looking like exactly what he was, a middle-aged construction project manager who had been carrying something heavy for too long and had finally made the decision to set it down, regardless of what it cost him. He was 44. He wore a jacket that was slightly too formal for him, like he had dressed for an occasion he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for. He sat down in the witness chair. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him with the steady, reassuring directness she had learned from years of watching her father talk to people who were nervous about telling the truth. You looked at them like the truth was worth what it cost because it was, and they needed to see that you believed it before they could believe it themselves. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you were a project manager for Whitmore Urban Development's Harbor Point development." "I was," he said, "from the start of the project until February of last year." "And why did your employment end in February of last year?" He cleared his throat. "I was terminated. Richard Whitmore called me into his office and told me my position was being eliminated." "Did he give you a reason?" "He said the project was moving into a new phase, and they needed different skill sets." Samuel Reed's voice was quiet but steady. "I'd been in construction management for 16 years. I knew what that meant." "What did it mean?" "It meant I'd seen something they didn't want me talking about." Preston objected. Speculation. Judge Maddox sustained the objection and asked Samuel Reed to limit his testimony to what he had personally observed. "Mr. Reed," Claire continued. What did you personally observe at the Harbor Point site in the months before your termination? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive gathering. The way people gather themselves when they're about to say something they've rehearsed in their head many times, but never said out loud in an official setting. I observed structural inspections being signed off on by inspectors who were not present for the inspections, he said. The room tightened. I observed cost documentation for foundation work that did not correspond to the work that had actually been performed. Can you be more specific? The foundation specifications called for a particular grade of reinforced concrete in the load-bearing structures of the East Residential Tower. What was poured was a lower grade. The documentation submitted to the city shows the specified grade. The actual building has the cheaper grade. Claire let that sit for 3 full seconds. Did you raise these concerns? I raised them with my direct supervisor first. He told me to document my observations and submit them through internal channels. Samuel Reed looked at his hands briefly. I did that. 2 weeks later, I was called into Richard Whitmore's office. Did Richard Whitmore address your concerns during that meeting? He addressed them by telling me that the Harbor Point project was on schedule and on budget, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was going to create problems for the project and for themselves. Those were his words. Those were his words. Claire turned to the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 72, Mr. Reed's internal memo, documenting the foundation concerns dated January 14th of last year, and Exhibit 73, the termination letter he received 17 days later. Preston objected on relevance grounds. Judge Maddox overruled. This goes directly to the question of asset valuation and liability, Mr. Hale. The court needs to understand the true condition of the Harbor Point property. Continue, Mrs. Whitmore. Claire continued. She walked Samuel Reed through what he had observed methodically and without drama, letting the specifics accumulate into a picture that was far more disturbing than any single detail on its own. Inspection reports signed by people who weren't there, cost documentation that didn't match the work, a project manager who raised concerns and lost his job 17 days later. And then she asked, Mr. Reed, in your professional judgment, what are the implications of the foundation issue you described for the Harbor Point residential tower? Preston objected again. Calls for expert opinion the witness is not qualified to provide. Mr. Reed has 16 years of construction project management experience, Claire said. He is qualified to speak to the practical implications of material substitution in structural foundations. Judge Maddox considered. I'll allow it. The witness will limit his testimony to his professional experience in construction management. Samuel Reed looked at Claire. If the foundation specifications weren't met, he said carefully, then the load-bearing capacity of those structures is not what the engineers certified. In a residential building of that height, in an area with the soil conditions Harbor Point sits on, he paused. It's a serious safety concern. People are going to live in that building. He said the last sentence quietly, like it was the reason he was sitting in that chair at all. The silence that followed was not the silence of legal maneuvering or strategic calculation. It was the silence of a room full of human beings absorbing the idea that somewhere in Charlotte, North Carolina, a building was being completed that might not be safe for the people scheduled to move into it. Richard's face had gone a color that was not quite gray and not quite white, but somewhere in between. Preston was writing rapidly on his notepad. Judge Maddox looked at her own notes for a long moment. Then she looked at Richard's table. Mr. Hale, does petitioner wish to cross-examine? Preston stood. His cross-examination of Samuel Reed was aggressive in a way that his other cross-examinations had not been. He challenged Reed's credentials, his objectivity, his potential financial motivation for testifying his relationship with Claire. He implied that Reed was a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Samuel Reed answered every question with the same quiet steadiness he'd brought to his direct testimony. He didn't get angry. He didn't become defensive. He simply answered clearly and specifically, and then waited for the next question. At one point, Preston said, "You're asking this court to accept on your word alone that a major development project has serious structural deficiencies. Isn't it possible you simply misunderstood what you observed?" Samuel Reed looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I've been in construction management for 16 years. I know the difference between the right concrete and the wrong concrete. I know it when I'm standing next to the pour, and I know it when I'm reading the test results. I didn't misunderstand anything." Preston sat down. Claire did not call another witness immediately. Instead, she stood and said, "Your Honor, at this time I would like to return to the document bearing my signature that Petitioner's Counsel introduced yesterday, the Harbor Point Authorization Form." Judge Maddox nodded. "Proceed." Claire walked to the center of the room with the document. She held it up. She looked at Richard. "This document," she said, "bears my name. It appears to authorize a financial amendment that, in light of Mr. Reed's testimony, we now understand relates to a cost substitution decision affecting the structural integrity of a residential building where people are going to live." She set the document on the edge of the clerk's desk. "My husband put my name on this document because he believed that if investigators ever came asking questions about Harbor Point, about the inspections, about the cost documentation, about the materials, the conversation would turn to me instead of him." She looked at Richard steadily. "He said so explicitly in writing to Grant Mercer. The email is in evidence. He called it the Claire signature problem and said it was handled." Richard's hand came down flat on the table in front of him. Not a slam, a controlled pressure, a man pressing down on something to keep it from moving. Preston put a hand on his arm. "The metadata proves the document was created after the date it bears." Claire continued, her voice perfectly controlled. "The Savannah records prove I was not in Charlotte on that date. The email proves the intent, and Mr. Reed's testimony proves why it mattered enough to forge a document in the first place." She looked at Judge Maddox. "Your Honor, I want this court to understand something clearly. I am not here because my husband had an affair. I'm not here because he built a successful business. I'm not here because our marriage failed." She paused. "I'm here because my husband decided that the best way to protect himself from the consequences of his own decisions was to make me responsible for them. And he believed he could do that because he had spent 18 years convincing me and everyone around us that I was incapable of understanding what he was doing." She picked up the document one more time. "He was wrong about that." She set it down, and she returned to her seat. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet scratch of reporters writing. Then Richard moved. He leaned toward Preston and said something urgent, something clipped and pressured. Preston listened. He turned slightly toward Richard. He said something back short, 3 or 4 words. Richard shook his head. Preston said the same thing again, more firmly. Richard looked at Claire. He looked at her for a long time, not with the contempt or amusement of the previous day, but with something that was harder to read, and in its own way harder to watch. The look of a man confronting the distance between who he thought he was and what the room around him was, now reflecting back. Then he said loudly enough that the room could hear it, "I want to speak." Preston said immediately and firmly, "Richard, don't." "I want to speak," Richard said again. Judge Maddox looked at Preston's table. "Mr. Whitmore, if you wish to testify, the appropriate process is to take the stand. I won't allow speaking from counsel's table." Richard looked at the bench. "Then I'll take the stand." Preston closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and assumed the expression of a professional managing a situation he cannot fully control. Richard Whitmore adjusted his jacket and walked to the witness stand. He sat down. He looked at the room with the familiar ease of a man who had spent his entire career being the most powerful person in any space he occupied. For a moment, watching him settle into the chair, Claire felt the old familiar pull, the sense of his gravity, the way he could make a room orient toward him simply by being present in it. Then she remembered the kitchen hallway, the cold floor, his voice through the door. She picked up her pen. She wrote one word at the top of a clean page: "Listen." Preston, with the resigned competence of a very good attorney, making the best of a decision he disagreed with, began a careful, direct examination. He gave Richard the opportunity to present himself in his own words, the entrepreneur, the builder, the man who had created real value and taken real risks. Richard spoke well. He always had. He described the business in terms that were compelling even now, even in this context. He described the consulting relationships as legitimate. He described Redwood Capital Partners as a properly structured vehicle with appropriate business purposes. He described Claire. He was more careful here than Preston had been in the opening statement, less clinical. He described her with something that sounded on the surface from a distance like affection. The early years, her intelligence, the sacrifice she had made. He said he had always respected her and had tried to ensure she would be provided for. He said provided for, the way people say it when they mean controlled. Claire wrote the phrase on her notepad and circled it. When Preston finished, Judge Maddox looked at Claire. Mrs. Whitmore, cross-examination. Claire stood. She walked toward the witness stand. She stopped at what she calculated was exactly the right distance, close enough to be direct, far enough to remain completely composed. She looked at Richard. He looked back at her. 22 years compressed into approximately 4 feet of air between them. Richard, she said, dropping the formal address deliberately, you testified that the consulting payments to Meridian Strategic Group and North Point Consulting Associates were legitimate business arrangements. That's correct, he said. Did you personally review the work product delivered by either of those entities? A pause. Those arrangements were managed by Grant Mercer. That wasn't my question. Did you personally review the work product? I relied on Grant's assessment. So no. I trusted my partner's judgment. Richard. She held his gaze. You testified 30 seconds ago that you built this company through personal attention to detail and hands-on management. Now you're telling me you signed off on over $1 million in consulting fees without reviewing a single deliverable. The pause this time was longer. Business involves delegation, he said. It does, she agreed. I'd like to show you Exhibit 81. She walked it to him. This is an email you sent to Grant Mercer on April 3rd, 2 years ago. In it you write, and I'll read it directly. Make sure the Meridian invoices are processed before end of quarter. Timing matters on this one. She looked at him. Why did the timing matter, Richard? He looked at the document. That's about cash flow management, he said. Standard practice. Whose cash flow, Whitmore Urban Developments or the marital estates? Preston objected. Compound question. I'll rephrase, Claire said without looking away from Richard. Did the timing of those consulting payments affect the reported value of Whitmore Urban Development at any point relevant to your divorce filing? Richard's jaw tightened. I can't say definitively. You can't say or you won't say, Preston objected again, argumentative. Judge Maddox said, sustained, Mrs. Whitmore, please maintain appropriate questioning form. Of course, Your Honor. Claire shifted. Richard, you testified that you structured Redwood Capital Partners for legitimate tax and estate planning purposes. When did you establish Redwood Capital Partners? Approximately 6 years ago. And when did you first discuss divorce with Preston Hale? The room went still. Richard said, I don't recall exactly. Claire turned to the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 82 billing records from Hale and Associates, showing that Preston Hale billed Richard Whitmore for a consultation described as Marital Asset Planning Review 6 years and 2 months ago. She let that land. The same quarter Redwood Capital Partners was established, she said. Preston was on his feet. His objection was articulate and technically sound. Judge Maddox heard it, considered it, and overruled it. Richard looked at Claire with an expression that had moved past strategy into something more animal and less controlled. She kept going. She walked him through the Harbor Point records. She walked him through the inspection documentation. She asked him direct questions about Samuel Reed's termination and watched him provide answers that were technically responsive and completely insufficient. She asked him about the internal report, a document that had been referenced obliquely in the Mercer emails, but had never been produced in discovery, a document that several pieces of evidence suggested existed. Richard denied knowing about any internal report. Claire nodded. She walked back to her table. She picked up one more document, a single page printed clearly. She brought it to the witness stand. Richard, this is a text message from your phone produced in discovery sent to Grant Mercer 8 weeks ago. It says, Ash report needs to stay internal. If Claire's team finds it, we have a problem. She looked at him steadily. Who is Ash in that context? Richard looked at the document. He said nothing. Richard, Dr. Pauline Ash is the forensic accountant who testified this morning. She was retained by me for this proceeding. At the time you sent this text, had I yet retained Dr. Ash? He didn't answer. Did you know about Dr. Pauline Ash before this proceeding began? Still nothing. Richard. Her voice was quiet, steady. The voice of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. How did you know about an internal report you testified under oath that you have never seen? The courtroom was absolutely silent. Richard's mouth opened. He looked at Preston. Preston was looking at the table. Richard looked at this gallery. He looked at the reporters. He looked at Judge Maddox, who was watching him with the focused, patient attention of someone who already understands what they're seeing and is simply waiting for the official record to catch up. And then Richard Whitmore, who had spent 22 years being the loudest and most confident voice in every room he entered, made the mistake Claire had been waiting for. He said the Ash report was a preliminary internal review of the Harbor Point financials that was never finalized and has no bearing on... He stopped. He heard what he had just said. Preston heard it. The entire room heard it. Claire let the silence hold for 5 full seconds. Then she said very quietly, "You just described the contents of a report you testified you have never seen." Richard looked at her. His composure was gone. Not dramatically, there was no outburst, no collapse, just the quiet, visible dissolution of a carefully maintained architecture. The face of a man who has just watched his own words build the wall he was trying to tear down. "Your Honor," Claire said, turning to the bench, "I have nothing further." She walked back to her table. She sat down. She placed both hands flat on the surface in front of her. She did not look at Richard. She did not need to. She heard Preston say from across the room, "Your Honor, petitioner requests a brief recess." And Judge Maddox said in the measured tones of a woman who had seen a great many things in 14 years on the bench and had learned to let the record speak for itself, "Request granted. Will resume in 30 minutes. The gavel came down, the room broke into sound, and Claire sat perfectly still at her table, hands flat, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle around her, like something finally put down after being carried for a very long time. Her father's voice quiet and certain. "You follow the pattern long enough, and the truth sits right there in front of you." She had followed it, all the way to the end, and the truth was sitting right there, in front of everyone. The 30-minute recess lasted 47 minutes. Claire knew because she watched the clock on the wall above the gallery doors, without meaning to, the way you watch something when your mind needs an anchor and your body refuses to fully relax. She sat at her table. She drank water from a paper cup. She reviewed nothing. There was nothing left to review. Every document had been introduced. Every witness had spoken. The record was what it was, and no amount of rereading her own notes was going to change what happened next. What happened next was entirely up to Richard. She knew that. And it was the one part of this she couldn't fully prepare for, because Richard Whitmore had spent 30 years being unpredictable in exactly the moments when predictability would have served him better. It was in a strange way, the quality she had once found most compelling about him, and the quality that had caused most of the damage, the refusal to accept that a situation had moved beyond his ability to reshape it. The gallery behind her was quieter than it had been during the morning session. Not empty, the reporters were still there, and several of the same faces she had noticed over the past 2 days, but subdued in the particular way that rooms become subdued when something significant has already happened and everyone is waiting to find out what it means. She heard the door behind her open. She didn't turn around. She heard footsteps, the sound of Preston Hale moving back to his table, the rustle of his documents. Then a second set of footsteps, slower, with the particular quality of someone who is controlling the pace of their own walk very deliberately. Richard sat down. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. Then Judge Maddox entered and everyone stood, and when the room settled again, the air inside it had changed in a way that was difficult to name, but impossible to miss the specific atmosphere of a proceeding that has crossed a threshold and cannot go back to what it was before. Judge Maddox looked at Preston's table. "Mr. Hale, does petitioner wish to continue?" Preston stood. Howe was composed. He was always composed. But there was something different in his posture this morning, a slight adjustment in the set of his shoulders, a minimal but perceptible withdrawal of the confidence that had characterized his every movement since the first day of the hearing. Preston Hale was a very good attorney, good enough to know when the terrain had fundamentally shifted, good enough to know that what his client had said on the witness stand 30 minutes ago had not been a setback. It had been a confession. "Your Honor," Preston said, "petitioner requests the opportunity to make a brief statement before we continue." Judge Maddox looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who had heard a great many brief statements in her career and had learned that their length was almost never what the attorney predicted. "Go ahead, Mr. Hale." Preston said, "Petitioner wishes to acknowledge that certain discrepancies exist between the initial financial disclosure and the full picture of the marital estate. Petitioner is prepared to work cooperatively with the court and with respondent's position to reach a resolution that fairly addresses the legitimate marital assets." He sat down. The room absorbed this. Claire wrote one word on her notepad. She did not circle it. She did not underline it. She just looked at it for a moment. The word was "finally." Then she crossed it out, because it wasn't finally. It was just the beginning of the next thing, and she had learned over the past 4 months that the moments that feel like endings are usually just the place where the work changes shape. Judge Maddox looked at Claire. "Mrs. Whitmore, does respondent wish to respond to petitioner's statement?" Claire stood. "Your Honor," she said, "respondent appreciates the acknowledgement. However, I would ask the court to note that the discrepancies Mr. Hale has characterized as something to be worked out cooperatively are in fact documented and proven. The forensic accounting testimony, the metadata analysis, the witness testimony regarding Harbor Point, these are not disputed interpretations. They are established facts." She paused. "Respondent is open to a resolution, but respondent's position is that any resolution must be based on the full and accurate picture of the marital estate, not a negotiated version of it." Judge Maddox nodded. "Noted. We'll take a short recess, and then I'd like to address the Harbor Point issue separately, as the court has significant concerns about public safety implications that go beyond the scope of this divorce proceeding." That sentence, "the court has significant concerns about public safety implications," landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went outward immediately. 2 of the reporters in the back row were already on their phones by the time Judge Maddox's gavel came down. Claire sat. She thought about Samuel Reed, who had sat in that witness chair and said, "People are going to live in that building." She thought about how he had said it quietly, like a man who had been carrying the weight of knowing something dangerous and hadn't been able to put it down. She thought about how long it takes for a building to show its structural failures, how sometimes people move in and live in a place for years before the thing that was wrong from the beginning finally makes itself known. How the people who built it wrong are usually long gone by then, their names off the paperwork, their money and other accounts. She thought about Richard standing at the kitchen counter 18 years ago, laughing about something she no longer remembered, and how she had laughed too, because that was what you did. That was the rhythm of the life they had built, and she had not yet understood that a rhythm can carry you very far from where you meant to go. The recess lasted 20 minutes this time. When Judge Maddox returned, she had a different quality of attention focused in a specific direction, the way a judge's attention shifts when a proceeding has moved from domestic law into territory with broader consequences. "I want to address Harbor Point directly," she said before either attorney could speak. "The testimony of Mr. Reed combined with the documentary evidence introduced by Mrs. Whitmore raises questions that this court cannot ignore and is not equipped to resolve fully within the scope of this proceeding." She looked at both tables. "I am issuing a referral to the North Carolina Department of Insurance and the City of Charlotte's Building Standards Department for immediate independent inspection of the Harbor Point property. That referral goes out today." Preston said very carefully, "Your Honor, petitioner understands." Richard said nothing, but Claire heard him exhale a long, slow breath, and she understood that the sound was not relief. It was the sound of a man watching something he built for years begin to come apart in a specific and irreversible way. Judge Maddox continued, "Additionally, given the evidence presented regarding financial structures that may implicate parties beyond this proceeding, I am notifying the North Carolina Attorney General's Office of the relevant documentation entered into evidence. That is within this court's obligation, and I am fulfilling it." She looked at Richard. He was looking at the table. "Now," Judge Maddox said, "we will continue with the matter before this court, which is the equitable distribution of the marital estate. Mr. Hale, I expect petitioner's complete cooperation with an accurate accounting. Mrs. Whitmore has demonstrated with considerable thoroughness that the initial disclosure was substantially incomplete. The court will not accept another incomplete accounting." Preston said, "Yes, Your Honor." Richard's hand came up to his face. He rubbed his jaw with his palm, the gesture of a man who is very tired and is not trying to hide that he is very tired. Claire looked at him for just a moment, not with triumph, not with the particular satisfaction she had imagined during some of those late nights at the kitchen table that this moment might bring. What she felt was closer to something sadder and more complicated, the feeling of watching something collapse that you once believed in, even knowing it needed to collapse, even knowing the collapse was the only honest ending available. She turned back to her notepad. She wrote a number. The number was her father's estimate, the figure she had calculated from the full accounting she had pieced together over 4 months of what the legitimate marital estate was actually worth. She looked at the number. Then she thought about what she actually wanted. This was something she had spent more time on than any other single question over the past 4 months. Not the legal strategy, not the document authentication, not the pattern of transfers or the metadata analysis or the Savannah records. The question of what she actually wanted at the end of this, because she had understood from early on that she had the evidence to chase every dollar Richard had moved. She had the documentation to make this proceeding last year's if she chose to pursue every entity and every transfer and every consulting arrangement through every available legal channel. She could do that, or she could ask for something else. She had thought about her father's files, those color-coded folders in the spare bedroom filing cabinets. She had thought about the lesson underneath the lesson he always taught her, that numbers tell the truth. Yes, but the reason you need to know the truth is so you can make real decisions, not so you can punish, not so you can prove something, so you can decide clearly without fog what the next real thing is going to be. She had made her decision. She looked at Judge Maddox. "Your Honor," she said, "respondent would like to present her proposed settlement terms." The room stilled. Preston looked up from his notes with the slight surprise of an attorney who had expected more procedural maneuvering before anyone reached this point. Richard looked at her. "Respondent is not seeking the full accounting value of the marital estate," Claire said. "Respondent is seeking the following: her lawful share of legitimate marital assets, specifically the investment accounts, the marital property in Charlotte, and the documented equity in Whitmore Urban Development that was built during the course of the marriage, calculated on the basis of the corrected accounting presented by Dr. Ashe." She paused. "Respondent is also seeking full legal indemnification from any liability associated with Harbor Point or any other Whitmore Urban Development project, documented protection from claims arising from documents bearing her name that she did not sign and did not authorize." Another pause. "And respondent is seeking complete ownership of the property at 4417 Textile Mill Road." Richard's head came up sharply. Claire continued, "This property was transferred into respondent's name by petitioner approximately 4 years ago. At the time of transfer, petitioner described it as a liability and abandoned commercial property with ongoing environmental remediation costs. Petitioner has jokingly referred to it in correspondence and in conversation as Claire's little ruin." She looked at Richard directly. "Respondent would like the little ruin." There was a beat of silence. Then something moved across Richard's face that Claire had not seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, not the performance of reasonableness. Something more genuine. Something that might, in a different moment and a different life, have been close to admiration. He leaned toward Preston. Preston listened. Then Preston stood. "Your Honor, petitioner would like a brief adjournment to consider respondent's proposed terms." Judge Maddox granted 40 minutes. The room broke apart. Claire stayed at her table. She did not look at Richard as he left with Preston through the side door. She looked at her notepad. She looked at the number she had written there, the full marital estate value, and then she looked at the smaller figure she had written below it, which was what she was actually asking for, and she thought about the distance between those two numbers, and whether the distance was wisdom or simply the habit of asking for less than she deserved. She had thought about this for a long time. The conclusion she had reached was this: she did not want to spend the next chapter of her life in courtrooms. She had spent 4 months preparing for these 3 days because she had to, because the alternative was letting Richard erase her, and that she could not accept. But she was not going to let the next 18 years be defined by the last 18 years. She was not going to let Richard Whitmore, even in defeat, be the organizing principle of her existence. She wanted the indemnification. She needed the indemnification. Without it, the Harbor Point liability was a genuine threat that could follow her indefinitely. She wanted her share of what they had actually built. Not all of it. Her share. And she wanted that building on Textile Mill Road, because she had something in mind for it that had nothing to do with Richard Whitmore and everything to do with the woman who sat in her father's spare bedroom as a child, watching him organize his files, learning that the truth was worth finding, even when finding it was hard. She was still sitting quietly when the side door opened and Preston Hale walked back in alone. He came to her table. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is doing his job and is also somewhere beneath the professional surface doing something more honest than that. "He'll agree," Preston said, "to all of it." Claire looked up at him. "The indemnification is non-negotiable on his end too," Preston added. "He doesn't want the Harbor Point liability going in any direction that isn't contained." I understand that, Claire said. Preston hesitated. The textile mill property, he thinks you're making a mistake. He wanted me to tell you that the remediation costs alone are going to take years. Claire said, Tell him I appreciate his concern. Preston looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, with the careful understatement of a man choosing his words, You were very good in there, Mrs. Whitmore. She looked at him. Preston, she said, you knew about the Redwood transfers. You knew about the timeline discrepancy on the Harbor Point documents. You've known for months what the actual estate was worth. He didn't say anything. You're a good attorney, she said. I know you are, but you're going to have to think about what you do with clients who ask you to help them hide things, because eventually someone finds the pattern. Preston looked at her for another moment. He gave a very small nod. Then he walked back to his table. When Richard came back into the room, he looked different. Not broken. Claire had not been trying to break him, and she had not broken him, but smaller. The particular compression that happens to a person when the space they have been occupying, the space maintained by confidence and resources and the assumption of winning, suddenly has honest dimensions. He sat down. He did not look at her. Judge Maddox returned. Both parties confirmed their agreement to the proposed terms in principle, subject to formal documentation. Judge Maddox scheduled a follow-up hearing for the settlement to be formally entered. She reiterated her intention to refer the Harbor Point matter to the appropriate regulatory bodies. She looked at Richard. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I want to be direct with you. The evidence presented in this proceeding raises questions that go beyond the settlement of your marriage. This court's referrals are not punitive, they are obligations. The regulatory and potentially prosecutorial consequences of what has been documented here are not within this court's control or this court's concern. What happens next is between you and those agencies. Richard said, I understand, Your Honor. 3 words. The flattest, most drained 3 words Claire had heard him speak in 22 years. When Judge Maddox dismissed the session, the room released into movement and sound, the way rooms do at the end of something long and tightly held. Claire organized her documents one final time. She stacked her exhibits. She closed her folder. She clicked her pen and put it in her bag. She stood. She straightened her jacket. She turned. Richard was still at his table. Preston was speaking to him in low, steady tones, the voice of an attorney explaining next steps to a client, the procedural, the logistical, the immediate things that need doing. Richard was listening with the particular blankness of a man who is processing something that has not fully arrived yet. Then he looked up. He saw Claire standing there. She wasn't moving toward him. She wasn't moving away from him. She was just standing with her folder under her arm and her bag over her shoulder, looking at him with the calm, clear expression of a woman who has said everything she needed to say and has nothing left to perform. Richard stood. He said, Was destroying me worth it? The words came out quieter than she expected, not aggressive, genuinely asking. Claire looked at him. She thought about this hallway. She thought about the cold floor and his voice through the door and the word sitting in her chest like a stone. She thought about 18 years of small erosions. She thought about her name on a document she never signed attached to a building where people were going to live, put there by the man who had once told her she was extraordinary. She said, You still don't understand what happened here. He waited. I didn't come here to destroy you, she said. I came here because you tried to erase me. Those are completely different things. Richard was quiet. Your company didn't fall apart because of what I did in that courtroom, she said. It fell apart because of what you did outside of it. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences. She shifted her bag on her shoulder. I hope the Harbor Point building is made safe before anyone gets hurt, she said. I genuinely mean that. Whatever you did and didn't do, I don't want people hurt in that building. Richard looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was difficult to categorize. Not remorse exactly, not the clean, simple shape of regret, but something more complicated and less resolved. The expression of a man who is beginning a very long process of reckoning with the distance between who he believed he was and what the record now showed. He said, The warehouse isn't worth what you think it is. I know what it's worth, she said. The remediation alone. Richard. She met his eyes. I know what I'm doing. He looked at her, and she turned and walked toward the door, her heels on the floor, one step at a time. The reporters near the back wall moved toward her. She stopped. She answered 3 questions carefully, briefly, without drama. She said nothing about the affair. She said nothing to humiliate Natalie Cross. She said nothing designed to add to Richard's public damage beyond what the record already contained. One reporter, a woman from the Charlotte Observer, who had been in the room for both days, asked, "What do you want people to take from this?" Claire thought for a moment. Then she said, "There are people who spend so long being told they are incapable that they eventually believe it. I was one of them." She paused. "The most important thing I did in the last 4 months wasn't in that courtroom. It was the night I opened a box I hadn't opened in 18 years and remembered who I actually was." The reporter wrote that down. Claire walked out. The air outside the courthouse was different from the air inside, wider, less compressed, the particular quality of outdoor air after hours, in a climate-controlled building where everything has been tightly managed. She stood for a moment on the steps. She thought about the warehouse. 447 Textile Mill Road, an abandoned textile building on the edge of a neighborhood that had been when Richard transferred it to her name, the kind of neighborhood people drove through to get somewhere else. He had done it as a tax strategy, and because he genuinely considered the property worthless, too much remediation costs, too much history, too far from the development corridors he cared about. He had not been watching the neighborhood. Claire had. She had watched the light rail expansion planning. She had watched the new zoning discussions. She had watched the coffee shops and the small restaurants begin to appear 3 blocks away, then 2 blocks, then 1. She had watched the environmental remediation, which she had quietly maintained through 4 years of careful paperwork, approach its final phase. Richard had called it her little ruin. He had no idea what it was becoming. She had an idea. She had been building it quietly, the way she built everything important, without announcement, without performance, with the patient precision of a woman who learned from her father that the real work happens before anyone is watching. She pulled out her phone. She called a number she had called 3 times in the past 2 months. A woman's voice answered on the second ring. "Claire." "It's done," Claire said, a breath on the other end. "How are you?" "I'm good," Claire said. And it was true. Not the managed, careful good of a woman presenting herself as fine, the actual complicated, real good of a person who has done something hard and come out the other side of it knowing exactly who they are. "The building?" the woman asked. "Mine," Claire said. A pause. Then, "When do we start?" Claire looked at the courthouse steps. She looked at the street. She looked at the city that had been her home for 20 years, the city where she had arrived as someone else's wife and was standing now as simply herself. "Monday," she said. She put the phone in her bag. She walked down the steps. She thought about a nervous woman she hadn't met yet, a woman who would walk into an office somewhere in the months ahead carrying papers she was afraid of, married to a man who had told her she would lose everything if she fought him. A woman who had been told for so long that she wasn't capable that she had started to believe it. Claire thought about what she would say to that woman. She thought about a yellow notepad. She thought about her father's voice, patient and certain. You follow the pattern long enough, and the truth sits right there in front of you. She walked toward her car. Behind her, the courthouse stood the way courthouses stand, solid and permanent, and entirely indifferent to the individual stories that move through it, the ones that end badly, and the ones that end the only way they honestly could, with the truth sitting right there, where anyone who was willing to look could finally see it. Claire did not look back. She was already thinking about Monday. Monday came the way important Mondays always come, without fanfare, without ceremony, just the ordinary arrival of a day that happens to carry the weight of a decision made by someone who has finally stopped waiting for permission to begin. Claire arrived at 447 Textile Mill Road at 7:15 in the morning. She was the first one there. She stood in front of the building with a cup of coffee she had made at home and looked at it the way you look at something you have been planning for a long time, when the planning finally meets the reality. Assessing the distance between the imagined version and the actual one, checking whether what you believed was there is still there when you're standing in front of it without the protective distance of a plan. It was still there. The building was large, larger than it looked in the property records. The brick was old and solid in the way that old brick is solid, not pristine, not restored, but structurally honest, the kind of material that tells the truth about what it's made of. The environmental remediation was 3 weeks from its final sign-off. The zoning reclassification had been approved quietly the previous spring, while Richard was focused on Harbor Point and had stopped paying attention to a property he considered worthless. Claire had been paying attention. She pulled out her phone and called the same number she had called on the courthouse steps. "I'm here," she said when the woman answered. "How does it look?" "Like something," Claire said. A pause. Then with warmth, "Good. That's exactly how it's supposed to look." The woman's name was Diana Reyes. She was 47, an architect who had spent the past decade specializing in adaptive reuse projects, the transformation of abandoned industrial spaces into buildings that served communities rather than simply occupying them. Claire had found her through a contact at the legal aid office where she had once worked a lifetime ago, and the two of them had spent 3 careful months developing a plan that neither of them had mentioned to anyone who might mention it to Richard. Diana arrived at 7:45. She walked the perimeter of the building with Claire speaking in the practical, concrete language of someone who sees what a space can become rather than what it currently is. She talked about load-bearing walls and natural light and square footage, and the particular acoustic quality of high industrial ceilings. She talked about community space on the ground floor and offices on the second, and what the third floor could hold if they were thoughtful about it. Claire listened. She asked questions. She wrote things down on a yellow notepad. By 9 o'clock they were sitting inside on folding chairs, looking at drawings Diana had brought, and Claire was feeling something she recognized from very far back in her own life. The feeling of a thing being built that had not existed before the particular energy of a beginning that is also unmistakably a continuation. She had named it already, the Bennett Family Advocacy Center. Not the Whitmore anything, not a name attached to money or reputation, or the carefully maintained public image of a man who had spent years confusing generosity with control, her father's name. The name she had carried into law school and into a legal aid office and into a marriage, and had spent 18 years watching, become smaller and smaller until the courthouse had given it back to her. She was going to put it on a building. That felt right in a way that very few things had felt right in a very long time. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Claire's life since law school, and they were busy in a completely different way. Not the compressed, pressurized busyness of preparing for the hearing, not the fear-adjacent focus of a person building a case against a clock, but the expansive busyness of someone building something forward. She was reinstating her full legal practice. She was working with Diana on the building timeline. She was reviewing the settlement documentation that Preston Hale's office produced in careful, thorough installments, checking each page with the same precision she brought to everything, because she had learned the hard way that trust was a different thing from verification, and that the two did not need to be in conflict. The settlement documents were accurate. Preston, to his considerable credit, had prepared them honestly. Claire signed them on a Thursday afternoon alone at her kitchen table with a pen her father had given her when she passed the bar exam, a plain silver pen. Nothing dramatic, the kind of pen that was made to last, and did. She looked at her signature on the final page for a moment after she set the pen down. Claire Elizabeth Bennett. Her name, her full name, the name on her bar certificate. She sent the signed documents to Preston's office by messenger, and then she made a cup of tea and sat for a long time not doing anything in particular, just sitting with the strange and specific feeling of a chapter closing, not triumphantly, not with the neat satisfaction of a story that ended exactly as planned, but with the honest, imperfect completeness of a real thing that was actually over. The Harbor Point investigation moved faster than anyone had predicted. The North Carolina Department of Insurance sent inspectors within 72 hours of Judge Maddox's referral. What they found confirmed Samuel Reed's testimony in terms that were, if anything, more specific and more serious than what he had described in the courtroom. The foundation issue in the East Residential Tower was real and documentable. 2 other structural concerns were identified that Samuel Reed had not known about or had not had access to issues in the HVAC system load calculations and fire suppression infrastructure that, in combination with the foundation problem, represented a significant liability for everyone connected to the project. Harbor Point was halted. The news broke on a Wednesday morning, and by noon the Charlotte Observer had a story on its website with photographs of the inspection notices posted on the construction site fence and a timeline of the project's development history. And because reporters are thorough, and the public record is what it is, references to the divorce proceedings that had brought the structural concerns to light. Claire's name was in the article, not as a defendant, not as someone responsible for anything that had gone wrong, as the person who had uncovered it. She read the article once at her kitchen table, and then she put down her phone and went back to the building plans she was reviewing with Diana. She did not give interviews about Harbor Point. She did not comment on Richard's situation. She understood that the investigation was now entirely out of her hands, and she felt genuinely that was exactly as it should be. She had brought the truth into the open. What the truth produced was not her project anymore. What was her project was the building on Textile Mill Road, and the practice she was rebuilding. Her first new client came through a referral from the same legal aid office she had left 18 years ago, a woman named Gloria Marsh, 53 years old, married for 26 years, to a man who had systematically moved their shared assets into accounts she had no access to in the 18 months before he filed for divorce. Gloria arrived at Claire's temporary office. She was working out of a rented space downtown while the building on Textile Mill Road was completed, carrying a folder of documents she had organized herself with careful, anxious thoroughness. She set the folder on Claire's desk. She said, "My husband's attorney told me I have no case. He said I waited too long and I don't understand how the accounts work, and I should take what they're offering." Claire looked at the folder. She looked at Gloria. "May I?" she said, reaching for the folder. Gloria nodded. Claire opened it. She turned the pages slowly, not performing slowness, but actually reading, actually following the numbers, the way her father had taught her, looking for the pattern underneath the pattern. 3 pages in, she found it. She looked up. "How long have you been looking at these documents?" she asked. 6 months, Gloria said. "Every night after dinner. My daughter thinks I'm losing my mind. My husband thinks I'm just angry and not thinking clearly." "You're thinking very clearly," Claire said. "This transaction right here," she pointed to a line on the 3rd page, "and this one here, another page. These two together tell a story. Do you see what I'm seeing?" Gloria leaned forward. She looked at where Claire was pointing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said slowly, "The dates." "The dates," Claire confirmed. Gloria looked at her. "He moved the money before the account statements closed. So when I looked at the monthly statements, it looked like the balance was always consistent. But if you look at the transaction-level records, the money was already gone," Claire said. "It just wasn't showing on the surface documents." Gloria sat back in her chair. Her expression moved through something complicated, the particular combination of vindication and grief that comes when you have been right about something you desperately wished you were wrong about. Her eyes filled briefly. She pressed her lips together and did not let the tears come, and Claire recognized that specific act of will because she had performed it many times herself. "My daughter said I was obsessing," Gloria said quietly. "Your daughter didn't have a CPA father who taught her to read transaction records," Claire said. Gloria looked at her. "We're going to be fine," Claire said. "I mean that. This is solvable. It's going to take work and it's going to take time, but what you found is real, and I'm going to help you prove it." Gloria picked up her folder. She held it against her chest for a moment, the gesture of someone clutching something they have spent months building and are afraid to let go of in case it disappears. Then she set it back on the desk with a deliberate firmness, the gesture of someone deciding to trust. "All right," she said. "Where do we start?" "With the pattern," Claire said. "We always start with the pattern." That was the first case. There were others. They came steadily, not dramatically, not a flood, not an overnight transformation of Claire's practice from nothing into something enormous, but a consistent and purposeful accumulation of clients who needed exactly what she was building the capacity to provide. Women who had been told they didn't understand their own finances. Women who had been systematically excluded from information about shared assets. Women who had been isolated professionally or financially or both, and who arrived at Claire's office carrying the specific, recognizable combination of competence and self-doubt that she understood from the inside out. She was not a therapist. She was a lawyer. She was careful about that distinction. She referred clients to mental health support regularly. She was honest about the limits of what the law could do. She did not promise outcomes she couldn't deliver. But she brought something to the work that pure legal skill alone couldn't provide, the knowledge of what it felt like to be in that chair. To have the papers in front of you, and the doubt behind your eyes, and the voice of someone who should have loved you, telling you that you were incapable of understanding what you were looking at. She understood that, and she let her clients know she understood it without making the sessions about her. She had learned that from her father, too, that the most important skill in a room with someone who is struggling is knowing when your own story is useful and when it gets in the way. 6 months after the courthouse, the building on Textile Mill Road was close enough to finish that Claire could walk through it without stepping over construction materials. Diana walked with her on a Tuesday afternoon, and the two of them went from room to room the way you walk through something that has moved from plan to reality, and you are checking whether the reality held the intention. It had. The ground floor was designed for community use, a large open space that could be configured for workshops, legal clinics, financial literacy sessions, the kind of practical education that Claire's clients consistently told her they wished they'd had 20 years earlier. Not because they weren't smart enough to understand it, but because no one had ever sat down with them and treated them as people who were capable of understanding it. The second floor held offices. Claire's was at the end of the hall, a corner space with 2 large windows, and enough room for a desk and a small table where she could sit across from a client without the desk between them. She had a shelf along one wall. She knew exactly what was going on that shelf. The third floor was not finished yet. Diana had plans for it, and Claire had ideas, and they were still in the conversation phase of figuring out what it should become. She liked that. She liked that the building still had a room that hadn't decided what it was yet. It felt honest. On a Thursday in early spring, almost 18 months after that October night in the hallway, when everything changed, the Bennett Family Advocacy Center held its opening. It was not a gala. It was not the kind of event that made the society pages or attracted the people who attended things in order to be seen attending them. It was a small gathering of people who had contributed to building what the building had become. Diana and her team, the contractors, a few people from the legal aid community, Samuel Reed, who arrived looking more at ease than the man who had sat in the witness chair, and who shook Claire's hand and said simply, "I'm glad it went the way it went." And Natalie Cross, who arrived last and stood near the back for a while before Claire walked over to her. They had not spoken since the hearing. There had been messages, careful brief, the kind of messages two people exchange when they are trying to navigate a complicated shared history without either of them pretending the complexity doesn't exist. The messages had been honest. That was more than Claire had expected, and she gave it the weight it deserved. Natalie looked around the space. She said, "This is real." "It's real," Claire agreed. Natalie looked at her. "I'm sorry. For my part and for what I didn't understand I was part of until it was too late." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You sat in that witness chair," she said finally. "You told the truth when it would have been easier not to. I'm not going to minimize that." Natalie said, "I told the truth because he was going to let me take the fall for Harbor Point." "I know," Claire said. "That's still a choice. You still made it." They stood together for a moment in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but is not comfortable either. The honest silence of two people who have been through something significant together and are deciding in real time what that means going forward. "Is there anything I can do?" Natalie asked. "For this, for what you're building here." Claire looked around the space. She thought about it seriously because Natalie deserved a serious answer rather than a polite deflection. "Come to one of the financial literacy sessions," she said finally. "We're starting them next month. Bring someone who needs it." Natalie nodded. "I can do that." "Then we'll start there," Claire said. That was not a fairy tale ending. Claire had not been aiming for a fairy tale ending. What she had been aiming for was something true, and this was true, complicated, and imperfect, and forward-facing in the way that real things are forward-facing, rather than neatly resolved. The investigation into Whitmore urban development moved through its stages over the following year with the deliberate pace of regulatory and legal proceedings that involve many parties and a great deal of documentation. Grant Mercer cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced outcome. He provided information that connected the consulting payment structure to specific decisions Richard had made and specific instructions Richard had given, which closed several of the evidentiary gaps that the civil proceeding had identified but not fully resolved. Richard's company was gone. Not immediately, these things don't happen immediately, and Claire had known that, and she had not been counting on it happening at all because she had not built her life around his outcome. But within a year of the hearing, Whitmore Urban Development had ceased to exist in any meaningful operational sense. The name came off the building. The Charlotte Business Magazine profiles were archived. The university donation wall still carried the name, but there were discussions underway about that too, which Claire did not participate in because it was not her building and not her discussion to have. She heard about Richard occasionally, the way you hear about people in a city like Charlotte where everyone knows someone who knows someone. I was living outside the city. He was dealing with his legal situation. He was by all available accounts a man in the process of a very long reckoning. She did not celebrate that. She did not grieve it. She simply continued doing what she was doing. On a rainy afternoon in the spring, the kind of afternoon that reminded her in a specific and physical way of the October night that had started all of this, a woman came into the Bennett Family Advocacy Center without an appointment. She was standing in the reception area when Claire came out of her office between meetings, a nervous woman in her mid-40s, holding a manila envelope against her chest, the way people hold things they are afraid of losing and afraid of keeping. The receptionist, a young woman named Keisha, who had graduated law school the previous year and had exactly the combination of sharpness and warmth that Claire had been looking for, looked up at Claire and gave a small nod that meant she needs you. Claire walked over. "I'm Claire Bennett," she said. "Can I help you?" The woman looked at her. Her eyes were doing the specific thing that Claire recognized immediately, the thing where a person is trying very hard to hold themselves together in a public space because they have been holding themselves together in private for so long that the muscle is tired, but the habit is still running. "My husband's attorney says I should just take what they're offering," the woman said. "He says I don't have a case. He says I don't understand how any of it works and I'm just making things harder for myself." She paused. "He said I should be grateful for what my husband is willing to give me." Claire looked at her. She thought about a hallway, a cold floor, a conversation through a door. She thought about a box that hadn't been opened in 18 years. She thought about her father's voice at the dinner table. Numbers can be manipulated, but patterns are much harder to hide. She thought about every woman who had sat across from her in the past year and a half, carrying documents they had been told they couldn't understand, asking questions they had been told they weren't smart enough to ask. She thought about how long it takes to believe truly, believe in the place where it matters, that the voice telling you that you are incapable is not the truthful voice in the room. She said, "Come into my office." The woman followed her. She sat down across from Claire, not across the desk, but at the small table face to face the way Claire always sat with clients, because the desk was not the point. She set the manila envelope on the table. She looked at Claire. "He says I'll lose everything if I fight him," she said. Claire looked at the envelope. She looked at the woman. "Then we're not going to start by asking what he says you deserve," she said. "We're going to start with the truth. We're going to open that envelope, and we're going to read every single page until we find the pattern, because the pattern is always there." She put her hand flat on the table between them, a steady, grounded gesture, the same gesture her father used to make when he was about to show her something important. "And when we find it, you're going to understand it completely, because you are absolutely capable of understanding it." The woman looked at her. For the first time since walking through the door, she exhaled. Her shoulders came down an inch. She said, "Okay." That evening, after everyone had gone home and the building was quiet around her, Claire sat alone in her office. The yellow notepad was on the desk. The silver pen her father had given her was beside it. On the shelf along the wall, her old bar certificate stood in a simple frame. No display case, no dramatic lighting, just the certificate itself, her name on it, the date she had earned it, sitting quietly in the place where it had always belonged. Beside it was the yellow notepad she had carried into court. She kept it because of what it represented, not Richard's downfall, not the victory of 3 days in a courtroom, but the moment she had sat on the floor of a bedroom in the dark and remembered who she actually was. The moment the silence shifted from surrender into something else entirely, the moment she picked up the pen. She sat with the quietness of the building for a while. It was the specific quiet of a space that has been built with a purpose, not empty, not waiting but resting between the work of one day and the work of the next. She thought about Richard's question on the courthouse steps. Was destroying me worth it? She thought about her answer. You still don't understand what happened here. And she thought about what she had understood standing there that he had not. He had believed until the very end that what had happened in that courtroom was something she had done to him, a calculated attack, a betrayal, a woman who had decided to use everything she knew against the person who had given her everything she had. He had never understood that the opposite was true. She had not walked into that courtroom to destroy Richard Whitmore. She had walked in to stop being destroyed by him. The distinction was everything, because the goal was never his ending. The goal was her beginning. The goal was the building on Textile Mill Road with her father's name on the door and the woman in the reception area who walked in holding an envelope against her chest, and the moment when that woman exhaled and said, "Okay," and meant it. The goal was the next woman, and the one after that. The goal was every person who had ever been told by someone they trusted that they were incapable of understanding their own life, and who had slowly and with great difficulty and against the accumulated weight of years of being told otherwise decided to find out if that was actually true. Claire picked up her pen. She opened the yellow notepad to a clean page. She wrote Gloria Marsh next steps. She wrote financial literacy session date to confirm with Keisha. She wrote new client today, review her documents Thursday morning. She wrote call Diana about third floor. She looked at the list. She thought about her father who had kept his files in color-coded folders in a spare bedroom and who had told her every Sunday night that she knew everything she needed to know. Don't forget it in the morning. She had forgotten it for 18 years. She was not going to forget it again. She clicked the pen closed. She turned off the desk lamp. She stood. She picked up her bag and her coat. And Claire Elizabeth Bennett, attorney, daughter of Harold Bennett, woman who had once stood in a courtroom alone while the man across from her laughed, who had followed the pattern until the truth sat right there in front of everyone who had asked for a warehouse because she knew what it was going to become, walked out of her office through the building her father's name was on and into the rest of her life. Not because someone finally gave her permission, because she had remembered at exactly the right moment that she had never needed it.